Hello and welcome to Fantasy Writing for Barbarians. I'm John Negroni. I'm a published fantasy author with over 10 years of experience as a professional writer and editor. We're going to do another reaction video today, and I know there were some comments on the last one. It's not everybody's favorite type of format, but I promise to do a balance of these things, so maybe some reaction videos here and there, but of course we're going to dig into deeper topics as we like to do on Fantasy Writing for Barbarians as we do it. And for this one, I've only just kind of quickly looked at the video here, but I haven't watched the video. We're going to be looking at something from a YouTuber, I'm going to bring it up here, named Carl Duncan, and I have never watched one of his videos before, so this could be my first time watching. I don't know if anybody who might be watching here or listening via the podcast is aware of his stuff already, but if you are, that's awesome. Hopefully this is somebody that you already are a fan of. He has about like 7,000 subscribers, so a bit bigger of a channel than mine for sure. So I thought it'd be kind of fun to do like a smaller, or not smaller channel, but something that's kind of like closer, I guess, in my wheelhouse. Not that I can do much to promote somebody who has, so many more subscribers than me, right? But yeah, I wanted to look at this video. Natalia recommended it to me. Let's see here. Yeah, so 5 signs you wrote an unlikable character. And I find the subject of unlikable characters super interesting just in general. But as normal, we're going to be doing a fantasy author reaction. So I'm going to kind of listen to what Carl has to say about unlikable characters, and I'm going to try to talk about it and react to it through the lens of a fantasy author, because I suspect, since Natalia actually did watch this ahead of time and she cleared it, that there is a reason to look into this and maybe give that perspective. So I have a feeling, just kind of like looking, the vibe to me is that this will be a bit more general, something that's going to apply to multiple genres, which is great, but we will, for our purposes, be talking fantasy, because that's why you're here, right? So yeah, without further ado, let's start up the video.
Kinds of things that will make a character unlikable. While any novel will have its share of unlikable characters, you also need a few likable ones in there in order to draw the reader in. And it's those characters that you do not want to be sabotaged by unlikability. So today we're going to talk about 5 signs of an unlikable character that your reader would like if you would avoid. Speaking of things that you might like to do, consider subscribing to my channel if you find these videos something that is somewhat to your liking. All right, first sign of an unlikable character that we're going to talk about today: having a character who is too likable. Okay. Anything attractive is polarizing on some level. Readers are not a monolith in their assessment of a character. Even the most likable character is going to have some segment of your readership who will dislike them. To have a character that 20% of readers really love likely means that 20% of readers will find that same character unlikable, and the remaining 60% might be apathetic or generally neutral towards the character. I don't know if those percentages are actually accurate.
I was about to say, yeah, that did not strike me as scientific, but at least he addresses it here. It's an interesting way to look at it. Me personally, I don't really think about unlikable and likable characters as much. I think because in fantasy we have characters that tend to be so black and white so much of the time in terms of they're the villains, they're not the villains, that sometimes the likability comes less from, I guess, sadistic or evil actions, and it's more about, are they fun to read? And that's a whole other conversation. So it's interesting he brings up the too likable thing. I want to keep hearing what he has to say, though.
But the idea here is that the quirks and viewpoints and flaws and whatever else you have to bake into a character in order for some percentage of readers to like that character is probably exactly the same stuff that will make some people intensely dislike that character. Making a character that readers love is different from making one that no one will hate. When you dilute a character to the point where everyone will like them or at least not hate them, you run the risk of simply making people feel apathetic about the character, which is not good. This is how you end up with bland, forgettable characters in your novel.
Yeah, I think that's pretty well said. I think that this is really, really important advice, actually, a really good, important point. if you're writing fantasy, because I mean, let's be honest, when you have a fantasy character who is too polished, they start to feel like NPCs, side characters, like the kind of shiny paladin who never lies, is too good, never breaks a sweat, always does the right thing. And like, okay, for the most part, no one's going to remember that guy. But what we do remember is if that guy, for all of his like over polishedness, fails at something, or maybe has a surprising plot turn. We remember things like fit chivalry from Realm of the Elderlings, and we remember Geralt from The Witcher, who's he's always grunting and nobody likes him, but he still does the right thing, sometimes for the wrong reasons, but that's Geralt, right? Even Kaz from Six of Crows, I think that character, can be very brilliant, but also very ruthless too, and is also underneath it all terrifyingly broken. And these are characters who do polarize. Like they're characters who people are like, oh, I hate them, or they're written with risk embedded in them. But in fantasy, those quirks and those contradictions what amount to emotional stakes, because what's at stake, the contradiction kind of sets that up. You do want characters who are going to really bruise the page, if that makes sense to you, where it's like, God, they're so close to almost doing the right thing completely right, And so if you let your protagonist, really, if you want to go protagonists, not just side characters, if you want them, or if you let them be too angry or too soft or too kind of morally bent, I think that can be a good thing, you know? Maybe if you go to some extremes and yeah, let them be polarizing, risk it a little bit, because fantasy can be very intimate, even when it's epic. And the intimacy comes from people identifying with those specific traits that can be a little riskier, a little bit messier, right? And that's the kind of thing that gets readers arguing about characters in comments sections. So that's how you know they care. So interesting first point here. Let's go to number 2.
Number 2, that can make a character unlikable, relying on the hero villain axis to define their likability. People sometimes equate the heroic status of a character with their overall likability, and that's simply not true. You can have unlikable heroes and likable villains. Heroism and villainy will certainly affect likability, but the two are not tightly correlated. If you have a character like Count Olaf from the series of Unfortunate Events, or the series, a series of unfortunate
Isn't it
events,
a
whatever it's
series?
called.
Whatever.
That's a generally unlikable character, but he's also a very likable villain in that he's an interesting villain and he's a villain that the reader is generally interested in reading more about. There is more nuance to the issue of likability than simply whether a character is a hero or a villain. I think hero and villain map more closely onto who the reader wants to succeed versus fail. Usually they want heroes to succeed and villains to fail.
You could also say like protagonists versus antagonists, right? If you want to avoid the hero villain dichotomy.
The likability of a character has to do with how the reader feels when that character is on the page. Are they excited to read about this character? Do they find them deep and interesting? They may not rejoice in the character's success, but that's a different feeling than finding a character to be flat or one note or annoying or just not interesting. You can't expect the actions the character takes to naturally make that character likable. It will certainly help, but you need to go beyond that. A boring or egotistical hero pursuing the right things will not be enough to offset the unlikability built into the character. Making your character a hero is not enough to make them likable. Next up,
Yeah, I agree with basically all of that. And I'm thinking a lot about Wheel of Time actually, because I go through that all the time where I get to certain character viewpoints or situations on the map, deeper into the Wheel of Time series. And certain characters will pop in and I'm like, that character does not bring me joy. I don't want to be, in that character's head right now. Sometimes it's characters I even usually like, but in some books they'll be a lot less likable. Looking at you, Nynaeve. But think of A Song of Ice and Fire. One of the reasons Game of Thrones was so successful as a TV show, and why the books, of course, have been pretty enduring, is because it has all of these characters, but even the worst ones are pretty likable. Tywin Lannister, I don't like Tywin Lannister. I think he's a terrible, terrible person, but I like it when he's in the story. I like reading because what he's about to do, because his character is so interesting. And I'm always immediately like, ooh, Tywin's here. There's a presence to him that feels really good, you know? So if we want to talk fantasy too, the hero villain binary actually is pretty relevant because we're typically doing good versus evil stuff, or, you know, big external conflicts that necessitate antagonists that can be a little bit villainous, and that's great. But I do think that a lot of the time the hero villain thing can be more of a costume rather than, or putting a costume on a character instead of letting them be a compelling character who makes sense, who is villainous for reasons that make sense. And so it happens a lot in fantasy. I would take, for example, Light from Death Note. Great example, because in that, the villain is the protagonist. Light is doing terrible things. He's a despicable person. He is manipulative. He has a god complex, like ridiculous. And at the same time, he's completely watchable in the anime, and I guess readable in the manga too. I didn't read it though, because I think the stakes are built into his psychology, and people immediately identify with like, oh, I could, you know, a couple of wrong moves and I could be like this, right? There's a little bit of, yeah, a little bit of an identification there that can happen. You could also flip it around and say that Frodo is the hero, right? But it's kind of Gollum in Lord of the Rings who holds a lot of the emotional gravity by the end of the story, because Frodo reflects, or sorry, Gollum reflects who or what Frodo could become, right? That's what makes the story so aching to read, is because Frodo's literally walking around with this like cautionary tale attached to his hip. I think that fantasy in general too is so uniquely positioned to explore these moral ambiguities, because the world building in these stories tends to support a lot of, you know, the way that cultures can collide, the way that empires can fall. Your hero might be a traitor in somebody else's folklore or just lore in general. So yeah, I would say, yeah, don't write to align your character just with the good guys or whatever you want to say. Write to make us afraid of what they might choose next, whatever that might be. So really good so far. Let's do just one more, and I think, because I think he has like multiple points here, but we're just going to do a little bit of the video, and you can watch the rest of it on your own, of course, and then we'll go from there.
Having a character affect the plot or be affected by the plot instead of having them affect the plot and be affected by the plot. A character can either be buffeted by events of the story, carried along by the winds of the plot, or they can take actions that affect the plot, actions that change and shape the world around them. I would argue
So
that in order to
agency.
have a likable character, you need to have a combination of both. The character should neither just be a lump that is pushed around by the world around them, nor should they be an omnipotent force that can bend the world and other characters to their will. A character who lacks agency, who never takes actions that affect the plot, is generally going to be unlikable. Readers generally like to read about characters who are pursuing their goals and making progress and have motivations that they pursue. Now, there are stories out there that center around characters who, for whatever reason, lack agency to some degree and really don't participate in the story. But in those stories, the character's lack of agency is a central theme of the story. It's an intentional removal of character agency in order to tell a particular story. You see this in stories where a character is depressed or imprisoned or otherwise stripped of their agency. When a character unintentionally lacks agency, when you don't mean for them to be a character who doesn't have agency, that's when you run into problems. That's when the lack of agency can make a character more unlikable. At the same time, you don't want a character who is able to escape consequences or that seems to bend other characters to their will. This, I think, is ultimately the problem with Mary Sue slash Gary Stu type characters.
Yeah.
You have a character who can be an asshole and is still fawned over by all the other characters. You have a character who is immeasurably brilliant and never wrong about anything because the author really, really likes this character. That's fundamentally what you have when you have a Mary slash Gary Sue slash Stu situation. You have a character who is unrealistically affecting the world around them to a higher degree than would be expected. Sure, all of the other minions are knocked out after 2 kicks to the head, but our hero can take at least 3 dozen kicks to the head, a few swipes from a katana, and a bullet wound to the shoulder while still being able to crack wise with a lovely smirk across their perfectly shaped face. This is not good. These are characters who are not affected
Sometimes it can be good, I have to say. Sometimes. It depends on the context and if you do it right. But yeah.
by the world, but do affect the world. Every character should be balanced between the effect they have on the world and the effect that the world has on them. It should be a circuit. It should be a relationship between the character and the world. Going too far in either direction can lead to an unlikable character. Next up in our
Yeah, and again, we'll finish out the rest of the video, or you can finish out the rest of the video in your own time. So thank you, Carl. Really interesting stuff. And so that last point, so he's talking about like characters have to affect the plot, right? And be affected by it. It's like a combination of the two things, right? And I say yes, like definitely, because this is where a lot of fantasy writers get tripped up when I'm looking at manuscripts. I'm looking at people's outlines, especially. Oh, so much, especially when people want to go with like chosen one tropes. If your protagonist is just reacting to prophecies that say they're special, they're going to feel like to readers like a weather vane. They're just twisting in whatever direction the world is, going in. And if they bulldoze through consequences, like, oh my gosh, this character should have died, but it's like they have a cheat code. It's like they have Game Shark or something. Well, like a video game where you can just use cheat codes, it gets pretty boring, and it's just kind of like like a player in a video game without any stakes. I think the great fantasy characters that you can draw from to avoid this kind of thing, they should be bending the world. They should be bleeding because of the world around them. I mean, look at Zuko in Avatar: The Last Airbender. He starts with just this tunnel vision goal of capturing the Avatar. He literally has a scar that shows that this world has not been kind to him, right? It's storytelling through visual. And by the end of the story, by the very end of it, spoilers for the show that came out in 2005, 20 years ago, he's been completely, or he has rewritten his moral code through a lot of things that have happened, mainly his own suffering, all the choices that he has made, both good and bad, rippling across the plot of the story. And another good example of this would be Rin from the Poppy War. I think that every time that Rin acts, she pays for it. She makes bad decisions all the time, but it's like a loop, right? It's action, then there's some consequence, then there's some evolution. And then that's where the readers are going to lock in. So yeah, agency is always super good. Agency is important, but agency also has to be very earned, because especially in a fantasy story where you have all of these moving parts and you want people to feel immersed in the world, you definitely want to make it feel like this world lives outside of the character. Another great example would be One Piece. I talk about One Piece all the time, but one of the greatest stories ever told, and it's not even done yet. But what's cool about One Piece is it's thousands, of manga chapters at this point. 1150, I think, is the latest now. So 1,150 manga chapters, well over 1,000, almost 1,100 anime episodes, I want to say, if not already. And as you progress through that series, through this epic series, this world feels huge because as events happen, the other things are happening in the world at the same time. And you find out like other battles are happening. They will be in like one island for a set amount of time, and then the characters will come out of it and be like, the world has changed since then, or a bunch of other things have come into motion, and you just feel like there's a real inertia, there's a real momentum to the story because anything can happen, things are constantly happening. And this, it's really interesting we're talking about this and something about likable and unlikable characters, but this is just a great reminder that if your characters are in this world and it feels like they are both shaping it and they're shaped by it at the same time, that's a nice little magic trick that doesn't get talked about too much. So I like that. So again, thank you to Carl. Appreciate the opportunity to look at this, and to Natalia, who sent this my way. If you like this kind of format, I'm glad. If you didn't, don't worry. We have other kinds of videos on the feed for sure, and podcast episodes too if you're an audio only listener. So all that said, we're going to call it here for now. So if you are a fan of fantasy writing for Barbarians, one thing I always want to remind you is that if you have advice, you have a question for me, there's 2 easy ways to hit us up. The number one way is you can send us an email, fantasywritingforbarbarians@gmail.com, because through emails, we can maybe do a whole episode around a question you might have. But another amazing thing you can do is join the Discord, because in the Discord, you get to hang out with us. You can chat with me in particular. I'm there. We have a nice little writing channel, and you can get all the latest episodes of the podcast, and you can be in the in-between drafts world, which has all kinds of topics and stuff, not just writing and fantasy. It's fun too, because we've had some, Discord folks, Discord friends who have jumped in and been like, oh yeah, fantasy writing for barbarians. And then next thing I know, I see them chatting away in the games channel and the anime channel and all that stuff. So it's really cool to see. Thank you if that is you. So that's going to do it for us this time. Thank you so much for watching or listening, and be sure to keep on writing if that's what you feel like doing.